I'm going to turn mine off as well. We'll just leave Rob on. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, Krista.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your kind introduction. And it's a very exciting time for me to be here tonight talking about plants and Amazonian plants. So what I wanted to do was start out by mentioning a couple of things. And let me make sure, there we go. I wanted to have you gaze at this view from the canopy walkway while I mention that I'm here in my New York Botanical Garden office because the internet's better here than at home. So welcome from NYBG here in the Bronx. I also wanted to mention that in my talk tonight about plant adaptations, I'm going to hit the highlights. There's certainly a lot more to say. So if you have questions, I do want to have a question and answer session at the end. Also, if you have questions after that, if you want to email me, that's fine. I'll be focusing on adaptations that are mostly morphologic adaptations because they're the most obvious and they're certainly quite fascinating, but by no means are morphologic adaptations the only ones. For example, there are physiologic adaptations and they're often linked with morphologic adaptations. And they're quite fascinating too. The photos that I'll be showing you are mine from Peru, unless I say otherwise in the captions. And the exceptions are from regions that have rainforests that are vegetationally very similar to those in Peru, in Amazonian Peru. Also, I'd like this to be interactive. So there will be times when I will pause and ask you questions, and I'll also invite you to ask me questions. So feel free to write into the chat, and I will be happy to answer your questions along the way as best as I can. And I've already invited Chris to help me in forwarding those questions. So back to this view from the canopy walkway. As we look out, we see amazing diversity. Diversity in which almost every plant you see, almost every tree is a different species. Very, very different pattern of diversity than what we see here in the temperate region, where we see an oak-dominated or a maple-dominated forest, for example. So one of the big questions that I have as a biodiversity scientist is, how do we get this amazing diversity? And one of the keys to understanding diversity is adaptations. When we understand adaptations and their evolution, we have a big jump on understanding diversity. And so that's why I'm so thrilled that Krista invited me to present this webinar tonight. I'm really excited about it. So there we go. The first question really is, what is an adaptation? And I'd like you to think about that and go ahead and respond in the chat, and we'll see what people come up with. We want to basically settle on a definition of adaptation before we get going much farther. And I see, I can see some people. I am having trouble viewing the chat window right now. So I see Nancy. Go ahead, Nancy, if you want. I see you waving your hand.
Hi.
Hi, Nancy.
I'm down in North Carolina.
Okay, so what do you think? What's an adaptation?
Of that plant? See,
In general, please. Just basically, let's settle on a working definition of adaptation. And
what does it mean? Oh,
yeah, what does it mean? What is an adaptation?
Some kind of change that continues on with the species. At some point, there's a change that makes it for survival wise be a good thing for them.
Okay, so you're talking about a change, you're talking about survival, you're talking about something that's beneficial.
Yeah.
That's great. All of that certainly is true. Anybody else, please?
I can read the chat ones to you as well.
Yeah, please go ahead with that, Krista, because
Yeah, so for sure.
despite my best efforts, I'm not seeing the chat link.
That's all right. A feature, this is from Monica, a feature that increases chance of survival and or reproduction. From Seth, evolutionary change based on external influence. From Judy, physical or behavioral characteristic that develops over time that improves the species survival. Amanda, adaptation is a form or function that increases the survivability and reproduction of the species. Kathy, a change that helps an organism to survive more effectively in its environment. And Jordan, an inherited adaptation that allows an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment.
These are excellent, and actually I got the chat window back, so I'm okay
Great.
now. Thanks, Krista.
Yep.
But this is wonderful. I see lots of excellent answers here. So people are talking about heritability. These are genetically inherited traits. They're beneficial. They increase survivability. Absolutely, all of these things. So the thing about an adaptation is it not only increases survivability, but it increases fitness. Now, fitness has a very specialized definition, and it is the ability of an organism to pass on genes. And practically speaking, we mean that an organism leaves offspring, an organism produces offspring. So what we're talking about with an adaptation is it's a trait that allows a species, an individual of the species, to increase its production of offspring. And certainly we're talking about genetic survivorship, genetic survivability. So that's absolutely right. All those definitions were great. So what I'd like you to do now is put yourself in the position of a plant. Think like a plant. We're talking about adaptations of plants, but I want you to think like a plant, because think about what sorts of adaptations would be important, what factors of the environment would plants be adapting for, and why are these important? So when we think like plants, we got to think that we're stuck in place. Most plants can't move. Even those like Venus flytrap that don't move very far. Often plants like these Amazonian rainforest trees are very long-lived. So that's another big factor that makes most plants different than we are. And then another thing is that plants are very, very subject to their local environment, their immediate environment. So now that I've given you a little bit of time to think about this, I'd like to see, and if you could write into the chat, please, what you think would be important factors to which plants would adapt, what factors of their environment. So I see light, dispersal, nutrients, water, absolutely. All of these things are absolutely right. More sunlight, water, nutrients, protection for pests, absolutely. Avoiding getting eaten, similar thing, avoiding herbivory, yep. Carbon, soil, perfect. All these things are great. So really what I wanted you to think about was, what are the requirements for plant life? Deforestation, yes, that's important too, because it has a great influence not only on those plants that are killed, but on those plants that remain too. The environment is radically changed. Pollinators. So I'm going to move on to this slide now, and what I've done is I've listed resources necessary for plant life. And I think you folks name just about every one of these things. Light, water, carbon dioxide, nutrients, food, space, protection from herbivory, opportunities for reproduction, because we were talking about survivability, and certainly if a species is going to survive, the individuals of that species must be able to reproduce. So here's some key questions, and I want you to think about these now. And please, again, feel free to respond in the chat. Which of those resources do you consider to be the most important for Amazonian plants? And then I want you to think about why, especially as we go forward in the next few minutes. And then, closely related to that, what can be done in an adaptation sense? What can be done to optimize resource acquisition? So, any ideas? Which of these resources do you think would be most important for Amazonian plants? Sun, space, avoidance of herbivory, light? Because there's competition. Excellent. So Lori mentioned competition. Absolutely. The reason why these resources can be of varying importance, and this goes for all plants, not just rainforest plants, but the reason why different resources can be of differing importance depending on the plant species is because of competition. Competition limits availability of resources, and it becomes one of the defining factors in adaptations and the success of adaptations. So I see more suggestions. Reproduction, absolutely. All of these are very important. Protection from being eaten, because you can't get all the needed resources if you're dead. That's absolutely right. If you don't survive and pass on your genes to the next generation, it does not matter. You can have all the adaptations in the world, but if you don't have offspring, it doesn't matter. So what I want to do now is begin with light. Think about those questions, please, as we go through, and we'll discuss them toward the end. So again, I'm hitting the highlights here, but when we look at the rainforest viewed from the canopy walkway, we see that most of the individuals are trees. Most of the plant individuals are trees. And the trees are filling the canopy. It's a closed canopy system, except where there's been a tree fall or there's been human disturbance for a village or agriculture. So closed canopy, there's definitely a lot of competition for light. And this becomes even more clear when we consider what's going on in the understory of the forest. It's a very dense, even in the understory, there are many leaves, basically trying to get as much light energy as they can. So one of the first adaptations that's important for light utilization is Phyllo Taxi. And Phyllo Taxi is the arrangement of leaves on a stem or leaflets on a leaf. And basically, most plants have most plant species have a very specific Phyllo Taxi. And there are many different kinds of Phyllo Taxi, and I'll give you a few examples here. The strategy is to maximize light absorbed by a given leaf and to avoid shading other leaves. So we can see in this species that the leaves are spiraled around the stem, and in that way they avoid shading each other. Now, many spiral leaves also are very clumped toward the ends of the branches, and that makes sense because, especially if it's a canopy tree, that's where light is most available. This is an extreme case in this palm. This is an extreme case of spiral leaflet arrangement. So this entire thing is actually a leaf. It's very long, and that's the case in many palms. But each leaf is broken up into these smaller leaflets, which are leaf-like segments. And what's interesting, and you can see it here and also here, is that some of the leaflets are even pointing up so that they are not casting much shade, especially at the angle that they're held, from the leaflets that are displayed outwards. Another Phyllotaxy is Disticus or two-ranked, and you can see it best here and then also here. Well, let's look at duration now. Duration is the longevity of a leaf. And what we find in the rainforest is that essentially all leaves are evergreen. And you can see in this view of Cecropia that the leaves are quite thick and leathery. And in the rainforest, because they, especially in Amazonian Peru, where the climate is fairly stable all year round, meaning the distribution of rainfall is pretty much equal all year round, we find that the leaves last years. The average of those species that have been studied is 3 to 4 years. Each leaf lives 3 to 4 years. The record is 9 to 10 years for a given leaf. So one thing I want to ask you is, what's the opposite of evergreen for a leaf? I'm looking in the chat. Does anybody have a suggestion for what the opposite is? That's right, deciduous. Excellent. So Lori mentioned deciduous, and we are used to having deciduousness on the trees in Eastern North America. So why be deciduous? And the reason I ask that question is it helps us understand why be evergreen. So why be deciduous? Does anybody have any suggestions for that? I'm pausing. Snow is stressful and heavy. That is certainly part of it. Avoid herbivory. Let me ask you, would there be many herbivores at the time the leaves are not present, meaning wintertime? Okay, great. I'm seeing a lot of great suggestions coming in right now. Maintaining homeostasis in the winter. That's getting out of freezing temperatures, evaporation, absolutely. That is actually the main reason why in temperate deciduous forests, the trees, most of the trees are deciduous, because remember the function of the leaf. It's primarily for photosynthesis, and to photosynthesize, the leaf needs to have gas exchange. So especially for absorbing carbon dioxide, and that means through those stomata, the openings, minute openings in the leaves. And when those are open, there is another thing that happens, and that is water is released from the leaf. We call this evapotranspiration. And so in the wintertime, if trees held their leaves and photosynthesis was going on, in many areas in the temperate zone, the ground is frozen and water becomes unavailable. So if the leaves are releasing water through evapotranspiration, but it's not being replaced from the roots because the ground is frozen, those leaves will dry out and die. So ecophysiologists who have studied deciduousness have much evidence to support that that many of these factors are important, but the leading cause for deciduousness in temperate deciduous forests is because of the ground being frozen during the winter time. So do we ever get deciduousness in tropical rainforests? The answer is yes. In those forests in which the rains are seasonal. So for example, in many parts of Central America, like Costa Rica and Honduras and Guatemala and Belize, the rains are seasonal. There's a wet season and a dry season. These forests are rainforests, but during the dry season, much less rainfall comes than during the wet season. And many of the trees will be deciduous there. Now, the deciduous there is in response to a lower amount of water in the soil, not the soil being frozen. Okay, so we talked about duration there. Just realize that most leaves in a rainforest like the Peruvian Amazon that's wet all year, most leaves are evergreen and they're held for many, many years. So that's an adaptation to producing a structure that can function a long time, but avoiding the cost of having to reproduce that structure on a frequent basis. Okay, let's talk about habit now and adaptations of habit. So habit is the growth form of a plant. And the vast majority of the species in the Amazonian, plant species in the Amazonian rainforest are trees. And We know about emergent trees. Those are those that stick up above most of those that form the canopy. And the emergent trees have the benefit of being up above the others so that they have more light available to them. Of course, the costs of this are quite a bit too. So there's a trade-off here, and that is that these trees have to expend more energy forming the plant body, the trunk of the tree, all the wood that goes into that, and all those branches that allow it to grow up above the rest of the trees. Lianas are woody vines, and they're adaptive because these woody vines can be supported by the trees. And the lianas grow up along the trees, often all the way to the canopy. So they take advantage of increased light, yet they don't invest all of the material to form a trunk and branches. So they take up less space, and the energy budget is more favorable in the sense that the plant is able to reach the light, yet not produce such a large body as a tree. Herbs are non-woody plants to a botanist. Certainly culinary herbs or something else, but to a botanist, herbs are non-woody plants, and we talk about herbaceous plants. And these are plants that are usually low growing, but a few herbs can grow as tall as 20 to 30 feet, like bananas, for example, or lobster claw plants, heliconias. And one thing I should also mention about herbs is, again, they have an adaptation to being a plant, but not producing wood, not investing all the energy that goes into producing wood. And that actually is a very energetic, production of wood is an energetically costly process because of the density of wood and all the carbon that's required to build it. Another habit that's very interesting and very prevalent in Peru in the Amazonian rainforest are epiphytes. Epi upon phyte plant. These are plants that grow on other plants. They don't root in the soil. Instead, if they have roots, the roots anchor them to the tree branches, often near the top of the canopy. Thus, these plants are able to benefit from high light environment without the investment, without putting all the energy into producing a large body. Well, I wanted to mention a little bit about epiphyte diversity because epiphytes are so important in the rainforest. We find that most of the epiphytes, and they usually are very, very diverse in the rainforest. Most of the epiphytes belong to one of four groups. So if you know about these four groups, you will already know 80 to 85% at least of all the epiphyte diversity in a given area. So leading the charge for epiphytes, leading the diversity, are bromeliads. These are members of the pineapple family, the Bromeliaceae. Orchids are also very diverse as epiphytes. Many, many ferns are epiphytes. And then aroids, members of the Araceae, the jack-in-the-pulpit family, are also quite diverse. All right, let's talk, continuing on the theme of adaptations for light, absorbing light. Let's talk about leaf pigmentation. And I show you two views here from low down in the rainforest, in the understory. So a view along the canopy walkway trail, and then an herb that lives in the rainforest. And you'll notice that the pigmentation is uniformly, nearly uniformly, deep green. So generally, the lower the light level, the higher the density of chloroplasts in the plants that inhabit these areas. So higher up in the canopy, sure, there are some trees that have deep green leaves, but the majority of them have a lower chloroplast concentration, and thus their leaves are not quite as green. But there are some interesting exceptions to be noticed. And I have a couple of plants here that are from very low light environments in the understory of the rainforest. The one on the left is a bromeliad, an epiphytic bromeliad, and then the second one is a seedling. And you can see the seed here that's split, and then the shoot is coming up with these young leaves. So let's talk about the bromeliad first. We can see these alternating patterns of brown, brownish red. In fact, you would be hard pressed to really say that this is very green. Indeed, there are chloroplasts in there. It's just that the red pigmentation is more prominent. And then what I find interesting about this seedling is it's evident that chlorophyll is present, especially in these leaf stalks or petioles, but the blades, the leaf blades, are this amazing, striking reddish. So what's going on here? What it seems like is that, and this has been studied and been suggested and found in a number of plant groups, especially those living in the understory of tropical rainforests, that what's happening here is these red pigments are reflecting the little bit of available light. They're reflecting it back onto the chloroplasts, and chlorophyll can benefit from this additional reflected light, giving these a bit of a physiologic edge. Now, there's another hypothesis about why seedlings often have red leaves, at least for a time, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, now consider this one. Here we see a red leaf on the Cecropia, but this is from the canopy. This is an emerging leaf, a developing leaf from the canopy, a very highlight environment. So something very different is going on here. Why be red? And one of the reasons that I give this example is something that might at first sight look like the same adaptation can actually be for different purposes depending upon the specific situation. In this case, there's a lot of experimental evidence that indicates that the red is protective of the young leaf and its developing cells, especially its organelles, when they're in a very vulnerable and fragile state. So until the leaf hardens and develops a thick layer of wax over it, the leaf is very sensitive to damage from excess UV radiation from the sunlight. So in this case, the reddish pigmentation appears to be protecting the leaf. Okay, at this point, I wanted to pause and see if anybody had questions. And then I'm going to ask you a question. So any questions? If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And I love that you've been making comments and responding to some of those things along the way. The wax has UV protection. Yes, it's been found that many plant waxes do have UV protection. It's like sunblock that we use on ourselves. Any other questions? That was a great question. Red is less visible to some herbivores. We will be coming back to that. Okay, well, here's my question. When you think about adaptations, and we've been looking at all of these various adaptations, actually only a small number, for optimizing light absorption for the process of photosynthesis. Can you ever think of situations in which adaptations would be disadvantageous? In other words, when a trait could have negative consequences, or when there could be limits to adaptations. So does anybody have any suggestions for that? Are there ever limits for adaptations? After a major disturbance, Alyssa mentioned that. I like that idea, but I wondered if you could tell us more what you're thinking with that. When climate change changes your environment too fast to adapt, certainly, absolutely. Crowding because of too much success. So that's a great suggestion too. I love that because all these plants competing with each other for light and they negatively impact each other. But what I'm really getting at is adaptations, can they ever be disadvantageous for that organism that possesses the adaptations. High degree of specialization can backfire. Absolutely, that's a great one. High energy cost of specific adaptations, too narrow of a niche. That's getting at that matter of high degree of specialization. Herbivores figure out the adaptations and they counteract it. Certainly, herbivory and anti-herbivory defenses can be like an arms race. These are excellent. I feel like you don't need this webinar, but let's forge ahead. I really love all these suggestions. What I want to do at this point is take a break from looking at specific adaptations and examples of them and consider the question, are there any downsides to adaptations? Because if we understand this question and the answers to it, we will have a deeper understanding of adaptations and their evolution. So this photo is of my former teaching assistant when I was teaching tropical agriculture in Belize. And we were in this opening in which the Maya had their farm plots. And many of the students, and in this case, my teaching assistant, they grabbed leaves from this large aroid. And this is a real leaf. It also, this same species grows in the forest. It brings up the question, okay, we know that tropical rainforest plants tend to have evergreen leaves. They live a long time. So why, bigger is better, like this aroid, it happens, and the leaves get even bigger than this. So why aren't all rainforest plants large leaved like this one? Well, to answer that question, we need to think about these limits, and there are three types. The first one is our maladaptations. Basically, adaptive traits are not adaptive all the time. And several of you mentioned the chief reason. So why and when would they be maladaptive? Well, things can change. So climate change, for example, let's say there's some sort of change to the climate. It might be gradual, like with the rise of mountains and the resulting rain shadow. There might be desertification, aridification. There might be a series of droughts. Also, there could be forest fires that come through an area. Herbivorous insects may expand their ranges and start feeding on plants. So these are just some examples of the kind of changes that happen. When there is environmental change, selection pressures change, natural selection. When selection pressures change, some traits that may have been adaptive can easily become maladaptive. So in the case of this giant aroid, imagine that a herbivorous insect moves into the geographic area where this plant lives and starts feeding on it. Well, there's a lot of leaf tissue there to feed it. And you can imagine a very large boom in the population of these herbivorous insects, which could very quickly defoliate these plants. So that's a real example. And those kind of things have happened. So one of the things, we have a human expression that characterizes maladaptations well, and that is you can't be all things to all people all the time. The second kind of limits we have on adaptations are called constraints. Constraints are limitations that exist when theoretically adaptations could develop, could evolve, but in reality, it doesn't happen. These adaptations don't develop don't evolve the way that they theoretically could. And there are several reasons for it. One is cost versus benefits. A large leaf, think about how much it costs to produce that. How much energy, how much chlorophyll. Every chlorophyll molecule has at its center a magnesium atom. Magnesium in many soils is of low availability. That's just one example of a cost. Physical limits. How big can a leaf really get? Think about what happens if there's a storm and wind blows hard. That leaf would be ripped to shreds. And we see that in banana plants a lot in the tropics. Banana plants have large leaves and those leaves get shredded by winds. Imagine a hurricane coming through. physiologic limits. So that big leaf, how, from the plant's perspective, how easy would it be to pump water throughout the entire leaf and to withdraw sugars? Genetic limits. Species that have small leaves have genetic limits. They cannot all of a sudden produce large leaves. And then biological interactions. For example, I mentioned the case of herbivores. So the human expression that comes to mind with this one is reality comes crashing down. It just doesn't always happen the way we think it might. Well, one of the things that's fascinating about constraints is they often present really, really interesting real-life cases for understanding adaptations and their evolution, including extreme adaptations. And so I give you an example of what often happens when there's a constraint. Organisms will often evolve adaptations to confront that constraint. So big leaves, one thing I didn't mention is the leaf itself is heavy, but imagine all that water that comes with the rain in the rainforest. So those leaves become even heavier with the coating of water, and that's a liability. The plant usually cannot support a large leaf when it's covered in water. So there are a couple of adaptations that exist to deal with weight constraints are, first of all, drip tips, in which you can see the tip of the leaf is attenuated and allows water to run off of it and drip off of it quite readily. Another example are perforated leaves, in which the leaf tissue actually has holes in it, greatly reducing the weight. Well, the third limit to adaptations are trade-offs. And the example I show you here is from an understory sedge. It's actually a very large sedge. It's 5 to 6 feet tall. You can tell from the scale of my machete there. This is a species that lives in very dark environments in the understory of the rainforest. Very dark and very wet. These are extreme environments. So these sedges produce wide, long leaves, but they're very expensive to produce these leaves because there isn't much light. So much energy goes into producing these leaves. And so what the plant does is it produces leaves only rarely. So each leaf lasts a long time. I already mentioned that leaves tend to be evergreen. Well, these leaves invariably get colonized by epiphyllous liverworts and algae. And this covering of liverworts and algae reduce the amount of light that is available to these leaves. So a trade-off is a situation in which a negative aspect is put up with to allow for a greater good. And the expression that comes to mind here is you can't have it both ways. You can't have a leaf that's long-lived without it being colonized by epiphyls. All right, let's move on to water now. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about rainforests. So why would we be concerned about water? Well, there's a very specific situation, and that is with epiphytes. Imagine being an epiphyte, most of them in the canopy. It stops raining, the water drains away very quickly, and then these epiphytes have to deal with very dry conditions. Well, I give a couple of examples here of adaptations to deal with aridity in the epiphytic environment. And one is many bromeliads have channel-like leaves that are wide and have overlapping leaf bases. And these leaves collect water at their bases. We call these tank bromeliads because they actually hold tanks of water. And then many orchids that are epiphytic form these swellings at the base of the leaf blade. These are called pseudobulbs. They're not bulbs. They're actually part of the leaf. And they have water storage tissues in there, very much like cacti can store water in their stems. Well, I told you about the tank bromeliads having water in there, but there has to be a way to absorb the water. And here's a micromorphologic adaptation. The inside of these leaves have these trichomes covering them. Now, trichomes are outgrowths of the epidermis of plant leaves. And they can be hair-like, that's usually their form, or they can be scale-like. And in this case, we can see these scales, and here's a higher magnification, are very adaptive for absorbing water. Okay, let's talk about nutrients briefly. And we're back to epiphytes. So here's a tank bromeliad, and notice, as I said, water gets trapped here, but what else gets trapped here? Leaf litter. And it falls into the water, it slowly decomposes. That alone allows for nutrient input, again, by specialized trichomes. But it also allows for development of a micro ecosystem. These are mosquito larvae, but there are many other arthropods that live inside these micro ecosystems. Plant-held waters are called phytotelmata. So this is one specific phytotelm microecosystem. And the nutrient inputs from all these larvae actually are substantial. And they've been found to be, to allow these plants to live on the edge and yet survive. Well, buttresses are pretty famous for rainforest trees, and they're an adaptation that's directly linked to nutrients too. So most of you realize that in rainforest soils, most of the nutrients are present only in the upper few centimeters of the soil. So most of these trees have roots that do not penetrate the soil very far. The roots are superficial. Yet these are tall trees. So the buttresses allow the trees to have greater stability than if they lack the buttresses. And that's especially important in those times when the wind kicks up during storms. Let's talk about food. Well, you're probably again thinking, what's the deal? Plants are green, they make their own food. Well, that's the case for most of them. But I wanted to present a couple of alternative adaptations for food. So this is a parasite. This is a flowering plant that is non-green. It's a holoparasite, meaning entirely parasitic. This genus Hylosis attaches directly to the roots of rainforest trees, and it derives its nutrition. In other words, it takes sugars from the trees, from their roots, and that allows this plant to survive and yet not have chlorophyll. Now, there is another set of parasites, and I remember seeing both Hylosis and this genus in Peru when I was there. The parasite are these plants that have the orange flowers. These are not epiphytes. They're actually, if you follow them down, they make a direct connection to the host tissue and they invade the host tissue. And what we find is that these parasites have green leaves. They photosynthesize, yet they do derive some of their nutrition from the host. So we call these hemiparasites. Let's talk about protection from herbivory. Certainly herbivory is very common. It's easily seen in the rainforest. We can see all kinds of physical protections, such as these spines on the palm trunk, and also these stiff hairs at the base of the leaf blade. Another adaptation for dealing with herbivory, especially common in sedges and grasses, is that the plant can be grazed, yet it keeps growing. Now, most plants, most flowering plants, when they're grazed, they will die because the growing points, the meristems, are at the tips of the shoots. But in grasses and sedges, the meristems are distributed along the stems, which allow them the ability to sprout new leaves and thus overcome grazing. Symbionts, those organisms that live in close association with other organisms, different species. And in this case, that same plant that I showed you earlier with the mechanical protection, it also has symbiotic ants that live in the hollows, in these swollen parts at the base of the leaf blades. So it's absolutely fascinating. And this is a very specialized symbiosis. Usually there's only one genus of ants that will live in association with these plants. So when the plant is disturbed, for example, a caterpillar munching on the leaves, the ants will come out and they're very aggressive and they will bite the caterpillar and drive it away. All right, chemical defenses. So back to that question of red. It's been a very popular question among tropical biologists, and the latest thinking is that yes, red can be useful for seedlings for reflecting low light back onto chloroplasts, but it also, the red pigments are distasteful and they're repellent to insect herbivores. So here are a couple of papers in which empirical evidence was gathered supporting that hypothesis, that the red are chemical defenses for seedlings. The red, as the trees get older, the red disappears and the leaves are green, all green. Okay, let's look at reproduction for a little bit. First, pollination. Whole lot to say here, and I'll have to gloss over a lot of it, but there are many, many different kinds of syndromes. Syndromes are suites of correlated adaptations, and for pollination, we see traits that are correlated among things like color of flowers and bracts, shape of the flowers, nectar production, and scent production. And that's just the beginning of some of the traits that are correlated. So in this case, this is an epiphytic tank bromeliad, and these are modified leaves in close association with flowers. So the red structures are bracts, modified leaves. The small white structures tipped in dark purple are the flowers. The bracts are relatively open and the flowers are quite short. The red coloration is very attractive to birds, specifically hummingbirds. In this case, the hummingbirds that pollinate this kind, visit and end up pollinating these kind of flowers, typically have relatively short, straight beaks. And this syndrome is called ornithophily, bird pollination. Here's another example of an ornithophilous rainforest plant. Yet you can see that the flowers are curved. And this kind of hummingbird, a hermit hummingbird, is more like the pollinator, what would be expected for that kind of plant. Well, there are other examples of syndromes. Here we have a beetle pollinated or Cantharophilus aeroid. In this case, these are nocturnal beetles. And then what's going on over here? This plant, this sedge, produces no nectar. It has no petals. It's not showy at all. Does anyone have any guesses what anemophilus might be? Any ideas? I'm looking in the chat. Do you know what an anemometer is? What does an anemometer measure? So what is that root? Anem mean? Wind, you got it. Boy, such a smart group. So this is a wind pollinated plant. Wind pollination is relatively rare in the rainforest, but it does exist. Another interesting adaptation for pollination is polyfluoride. And this is the production of flowers and fruits directly from the trunk and branches. We can see it here in cacao, but also in this member of the Brazil nut family. And this adaptation is to allow greater access to the flowers by the pollinators. Certainly insects, but also bats. Many cauliflorous plants are bat pollinated. And so most plants have their flowers up in the canopy among the leaves, but in cauliflorous plants, they're down on the trunk, more easily accessible. Okay, I'd like to wrap up talking about reproduction adaptations with talking about fruit dispersal. So pollination is one part of it, fruit dispersal is the other. And I wanted to focus on one kind of fruit dispersal by birds. Certainly there are many fruit dispersers, monkeys, insects, birds, etc. But in this case, I wanted to talk about bird dispersal with a couple of birds such as trogons and motmots. And birds are especially attracted to fruits that are bright red, like in this aeroid, or blue, or in this case, sometimes blue paired with red. Okay, so just as I end, I wanted to talk about some resources that are available through New York Botanical Garden for educators and make you aware of these. So what I do is I just provide some screenshots along with links. And I know that Krista will be making this presentation available to you. So don't worry about getting the links right now. And you can also always follow up with me. But I do have these links. So we have our collections and resources, such as the library, which is one of the world's biggest botanical libraries. Botanical in all senses, gardening, plant systematics, plant physiology, lots and lots of disciplines. The herbarium, which is our museum of plant specimens. We also have collection resources, databases for the living collections in our conservatory, as well as the grounds, so on and so forth. We have the Handlens, which are popular stories based on herbarium specimens. We have general lectures and symposia, most of these about landscape architecture and gardening. They're mostly horticultural topics. But we also have our science lecture library. So we have a whole set of lectures. Often they're weekly or even twice a week on scientific research. And if you would like to join the mailing list so that you'll know the upcoming seminars, here's the link for getting signed up with that. So this link is for the archived presentations. We also have a plant information service, and this goes for virtually any aspect of plants. If you have a question about why your roses aren't doing so well, or you have a photograph of a plant and you wonder what its name is, you can send those in and hopefully get answers. In most cases, we are able to answer questions. We have about an 85 to 90% success rate in answering folks' questions. Finally, we have article alerts. These are features on recently published primary literature by staff scientists here at New York Botanical Garden. And with that, I wanted to acknowledge a bunch of folks and then open it up for questions. So I'm very grateful to people here in the States, especially my friends and colleagues at the Taft School, Mike McAloon and Amanda Benedict, who are here with us tonight and who made it possible for me to visit Peru. I fell in love with it. I'd been working in rainforests for a large part of my career, and when I got to Peru, it was a dream come true. Krista with the Morpho Institute also made it possible for me. Thank you very, very much, Krista. New York Botanical Garden supported my work there. In Peru, I'd like to thank every member of the Maijuna community. The Maijuna were so friendly and welcoming, and they're also such wonderful teachers. I learned a lot. Explorama staff, especially Pam Pukur, she really catered to practically everything that I wanted to do and put up with me shorting out the electrical system a couple of times as I tried to dry plants at Explorama. And then I also thank One Planet, especially Mike Gilmore and Liz Benson. Okay, with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Hey everybody, it's Krista. If you want to, you can certainly put questions in the chat, but you can also unmute if you've got questions. And you know, we can spend as much time as you want to taking questions if you've got them. So fire away. Alyssa has one. Does the size of perforations on leaves increase with the size of the leaves on the same plant? So I think are you talking about that monstera, that philodendron, like the Swiss cheese plant?
The short answer to that is yes, absolutely. So generally, the larger the leaf, the larger the perforations. Great question.
I'm just thinking about the botany of desire and how, you know, humans have sort of seen plants for our own adaptive use. And in particular, I was thinking about the use of plants for medicine. And would you say that in most cases plants have these particular chemical constituents because they're trying to become distasteful for herbivores? Is that why they would have all these various chemicals predominantly?
In those cases that have been studied in depth, yes, that is the short answer.
Thank
it
you.
appears that most of these are some sort of defensive compounds. In a minority of the cases, they're also products of metabolism, and as far as we presently understand, they're not directly linked to defenses. But as I say, and as you said, the majority of them do appear to be defensive.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Thank you. Interesting.
Nancy Troutman has a question. Why are there so many more plant species in the tropics compared to temperate forests?
You know, Nancy, that's a great question. It's one that's intrigued biologists ever since they started going to the tropics. The leading hypothesis is climate. So think about the tropical rainforests. They've never been glaciated. They've been influenced by glaciations, and they've served as refugia. So one reason why we hypothesize that climate is the leading cause is because we have seen, for example, through pollen studies, fossil pollens, that the amount and composition of diversity in tropical rainforests has fluxed over time. So when there have been glacial maxima in the polar regions, even going into the temperate regions, we can see some more northern or austral species, ones that typically are in the temperate zones, moving into and toward the tropics. So the fact that the climate has been stable for such a long time has allowed for the evolution of a great diversity of organisms and the development of many biotic interactions. So symbiosis is it turns out, as we study it and we understand symbiosis more and more, it's a great proponent of biological diversity, because when symbioses exist, a greater number of organisms can coexist than when symbioses are absent. So that's actually a great question, and people have written books on it, but those are the two quick, big reasons for the great diversity as far as we biodiversity scientists understand it. Do you think that change in the climate is a forecaster of less diversity? Depending upon the rapidity of the change and the magnitude of the change, yes. So what's troubling to us is climate is changing rapidly now, and it does certainly look like it's on a trajectory to change drastically. One thing we know from the study of fossil plants and animals is that when climate has changed drastically, it's often caused much extinction. And so we're very concerned that that's what we're entering now is well, we already are in a period of mass extinction, and we're concerned that it may accelerate all the more, especially due to climate change. I want to make sure I'm not missing any of these questions. These are great questions. Are there a lot of carnivorous plants on the rainforest floor? I'm thinking about relatively nutrient-poor soils in tropical rainforests. Well, that's a question that's near and dear to my heart because I do study carnivorous plants. The answer, though, is no. And there's a very important reason for that. And that is because to be carnivorous, and let me define a carnivorous plant, there must be 4 things present to be carnivorous, for a plant to be considered carnivorous. It must attract, trap, digest, and then absorb nutrients from prey. Well, it turns out to do that, it's energetically extremely costly. And the only way that a plant can manage to be carnivorous and survive is to grow in a high light environment. So think of it this way. If a plant is growing in a high light environment, it doesn't have to struggle to get light. There's a lot of light present. It makes sugars, it makes food for itself as quickly as it can. So these are plants already living on the edge because carnivorous plants live in nutrient poor environments. So they're struggling for nutrients. Nutrients are a great problem. And most carnivorous plants are poor competitors because they're barely surviving in extreme environments, these nutrient poor environments. So the thing about tropical rainforests, you would think because the soils are so poor that maybe there would be a lot of carnivorous plants in a rainforest, not in the Western Hemisphere because of the light problem. Now in the Eastern Hemisphere, there is one genus of tropical pitcher plants, and some of its species do live in low light environments. Most of them live in high light environments, but these tropical pitcher plants are called nepenthes. So there are a few that live in the old world tropics inside rainforests, but we don't find carnivorous plants in the Amazonian rainforests. We do find them in tropical regions like savannas where there's sun, where there's a lot of sun. So anyway, that was a long-winded answer. Sorry about that, but I could go on and on and on. Any other questions?
I have a question. Oh, sorry, someone else is talking.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it was just a silly question. I was wondering if you've ever discovered a plant that's unique to science and named it.
Kathy, thanks for asking. I'm a plant systematist. So part of what I do is study biodiversity, discover new species and describe them. Yes, I have.
Oh,
It's-
wonderful.
It's one of the great thrills.
Oh, that's exciting.
So when I was in Peru in March, I found a sedge that I had a great suspicion was undescribed. And, you know, I was in the process of getting permits. So the plant specimens are still there in Peru because I haven't gotten the export permits. And just last week, I discovered that the species was described. So I had the right hunch. And I imagine there are other undescribed sedges lurking in the Amazon. And someday I hope to find some more.
I'm sure you will. I hope so. Good luck.
Well, I'm really sad to hear that because I was counting on that sedge being named after me or something.
Yes. I hope to do that one day, Chris.
That's awesome.
Okay, Jordan, you had a question.
Yeah, with the climate change discussion about biodiversity being threatened, sort of what's the progress of describing maybe the most threatened species, or even beginning to catalog like which ones we should be like either collecting seeds for or trying to maintain in greenhouses?
So again, a question near and dear to my heart. In November, I hosted an international symposium on plant extinctions, and we had 8 expert speakers, and they were mostly botanists, but we had some top zoologists too, conservation biologists. And that was one of the things we dealt with. So I'm not just tooting my own horn, but I'm saying you may enjoy listening to the presentations, the recordings on the lecture library. That was one of the topics we considered, but to give a very short answer to your excellent question, and it actually is a long answer to do it justice. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still a long way to go, mostly because of infrastructure. We need to do a better job of coordinating among ourselves. We scientists and botanical gardens, we need to do a better job of coordinating among ourselves so that we can beef up living collections, we can beef up seed banks, we can do more field exploration in those areas that are most critically imperiled. So plant extinctions are happening as we speak, and it is one of our greatest tragedies. Most of the extinctions are happening in the tropics, and that's because of the rate of deforestation, but also because of the nature of the tropics. Many tropical plants have very small geographic ranges, sometimes as small as a mountaintop. So we deforest a mountaintop and we lose species right then and there. So we have a long way to go, and what I encourage people to do is to get involved, and every person who cares can make a difference. And that's another thing that we discussed during that symposium. So again, that was my attempt to answer, but in a fairly short way. Feel free to ask me more if you felt I didn't do that justice.
No, I realize it's a huge issue. I I'm thinking about the this areas of deforestation in the Amazon and how poorly described that some of them might even be, and just if there's any if there's any particular places or species that have been identified and there are efforts to protect them already.
One of the things, the bright spots I can talk about is the kind of research that my colleagues do. I spend most of my research time in North America because I'm the curator of North American botany. But I do get to the tropics, obviously, when I can. But I have several colleagues here who work exclusively in the tropics. So we have 3 plant systematists here on staff at NYBG who work only in Brazil. And they are in the process of describing lots and lots of new species. So the first step, of course, in conservation is making species known, naming them. If we can name them, then we can understand better where they live, what their conservation needs are, how humans interact with them, et cetera, et cetera. So doing more systematics is actually the beginning, and it's a very important beginning. So supporting scientific research is a very important part of the whole process. And if you want, talk with your legislators and ask them to do more for basic science. Thank you. Thanks for your question. It's a great one.
I'll interject here. Yes, Christy, well, I'll get you the link to the symposium recordings. We'll figure that out. And then Judy had a question that's a little further up in the chat. I've had my students investigate stomata on leaves of the temperate forest. They learned that there tends to be more stomata on the underside of leaves because of transpiration. I'm curious how the stomata compare on tropical leaves since there is less risk of losing a lot of water.
We find in tropical trees that the stomata are more numerous on the undersurface, just like in the temperate zone, because realize that the light is impacting leaves from above. And when there's more light, there's more evaporation, you know, all other things being equal. So your question is a great one because you're thinking, well, the air is humid, so there's less evaporation. Certainly, rainforest trees tend to be less subject to aridity stresses. Now, I explain why that's very different for epiphytes, but for rainforest trees rooted in the soil, there's so much rain, and it's like in Peru, it's evenly distributed throughout the year, that's not a problem. So we actually find in the rainforest that quite a few of the tree species even have stomata on their upper surfaces. So what I said before is true, that most rainforest trees have the majority of their stomata on the undersurfaces, but some of the trees also have them on the upper surface. And that's a big difference from the temperate zone, where evapotranspiration tends to be more of a stress. Did I answer that question completely?
Yes, yes, you did. So it's interesting, though, that the adaptation ended up like it's a similar adaptation in 2 different types, completely types of forest.
Well, the presence of stomata is what's called an ancestral trait in leaves. We find it evolved even before flowering plants evolved. So stomata are, in a way, a necessary evil. So to allow for gas exchange, there must be openings in the epidermis, because the epidermis is thick, it's usually covered in wax. And so there have to be these openings to allow gas exchange. But the evil, quote unquote, part of it, the detriment, is the loss of water through evapotranspiration. So it's one of those things, there's a constraint there. But the plant makes, I don't want to make it sound like it's teleologic here. Adaptations have evolved that allow the plants to deal with evapotranspiration, especially in environments where drought could be a problem. So in many plants, especially those in deserts, the stomata will be buried in pits so that there's less wind that moves across the surface of the stomate and would drag the water vapor away. So it's fascinating. Stomatal physiology and micromorphology is a very well-studied area because it's so important for agriculture. And so we understand a lot about stomata. It's really, really fascinating. All I've done is just scratch the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's quite an intricate balance between having stomata open and not losing too much water.
That's right. Absolutely. So here's a question from Monica. Has anyone tried to synthesize the sunscreen and leaf wax? Wow, that's cool. I'm not aware of it, but I have to be honest and say I have not looked into it. I think there could be something there, so it's worth looking into.
Awesome. That's a great question to end on. I want to be respectful of Rob's time and also all of you hardworking educators, because it is a school night. And I know that although it's a Thursday night and Friday's right around the corner, we want to try and keep these to an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. So Rob, thank you so much for this taste of adaptations. I mean, oh my gosh, I could listen forever, and can't wait to have another ramble in the forest with you to dig in deeper on some of these really fascinating things. So just a quick note, we will make these recordings available. My commitment for the next month or so is to get all the recordings from this past year cleaned up and posted, and we're going to launch a new monthly newsletter that's going to tie in the webinar to some curriculum connections and to phenomena. And we've got some great photos already sort of in the queue for phenomena for classroom use. And we've got some teachers in the alumni group that are going to help us start working on those. So lots more to come, and we'll get these recordings posted. And I make sure to save the chat so that I can go back and look at questions and get back with you on this. So thanks, everybody. Happy New Year. Happy almost February. And look for an email about the upcoming webinars that are headed your way. And Rob, once again, thank you so much. It was just a great night. I think what we all needed. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Krista. And thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.